The financial health of a company is as important as its growth. In a lot of cases, companies use borrowed money or debt to finance their growth. So in this video, we're going to take a look at debt to equity or DE ratio as another tool that you can keep in your toolbox when analyzing a company's financial ratios. At the end of this video, we'll also compare the Walt Disney Company and Netflix debt to equity ratios. Hey guys, welcome to Individual Investor. My name is Victor, and if this is the first time you're watching any of my videos, please check out my channel, and more importantly, please make sure you watch first my video on return on equity, where I cover in detail the concept of shareholders' equity, which is something we need to understand before getting into debt to equity ratio. The formula for debt to equity ratio is the following. You take the total liabilities and divide it by the shareholders' equity. Something to note is that some analysts and some websites, including Morningstar, calculate debt to equity ratio using the long-term debt instead of the total liabilities. Let's do an example real quick using the total liabilities to illustrate this concept. All right, here we have a straightforward balance sheet with some assets and some liabilities. The first thing we gotta do is calculate the shareholders' equity, which can be calculated by adding all the assets and subtracting all the liabilities. If we do that, then we end up with 400K. Next, we have here the shareholders' equity that we previously calculated. Now we take only the liabilities and we add them up. So we add 120K plus 100K, and that equals to 220K in total liabilities. And now to calculate the debt to equity ratio, we divide 220K, the total liabilities, over 400K, the shareholders' equity, and we end up with a debt to equity ratio of 0.55. Okay, I know the next question. What is a good DE ratio? Before talking about DE ratios, let's first cover the concept of leverage. If used properly, leverage is an effective way to increase shareholders' value and amplify returns, because you can use that borrowed money or funds to increase capacity or expand the business. However, too much leverage can lead to too much risk. The debt to equity ratio helps us visualize if the amount of leverage is disproportionate with respect to the equity. And the risk lies in the possibility of the company not being able to repay its debt or liabilities and eventually filing for bankruptcy. Like with other financial ratios, debt to equity ratio varies per industry. However, generally speaking, DE ratios centered around 1 are considered okay or safe investments. If you have a negative DE ratio, this is considered very high risk, since effectively this means that the company has more total liabilities than total assets. And if you have a DE ratio of 2 or above, that starts to be considered a more risky investment than companies with a DE ratio of 1. Now, on the flip side, if you have a DE ratio that is very small or close to 0, that could be a signal that the company is not making effective use of debt to expand or to maximize revenue. With that, let's now take a look at Walt Disney and Netflix and compare their debt to equity ratios. Okay guys, as usual, I'm gonna be using my Google Sheet here to keep track of all the data. I'm gonna leave a link to this Google Sheet in the description below in case you need it. All right, before we get started, I want to point out again that Morningstar, in this case, uses the long-term debt to calculate the debt to equity ratio instead of the total liabilities. Okay, so we're gonna be looking at only the total debt or long-term debt to calculate this the debt to equity ratio. All right. So for this example, we're going to be looking at the latest or the last fiscal quarter. And here we have the Walt Disney Company page on Morningstar. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go to the financials and then look at the balance sheet. Okay, perfect. Here we have the balance sheet. And if we look at the latest fiscal quarter, Q2 2021, here we have all the figures that we need. So first, let me grab the total debt. So 56.15 billion. And then the total equity is 89.79 billion. Perfect. And now the debt to equity ratio is simply the total debt divided by the shareholders' equity or total equity. And here we have 0.63. So as you can see, obviously all these financial ratios are calculated for you on websites like Morningstar or Yahoo Finance. In this case, they have calculated 0.66. It's not quite the same, but close enough. Let's work with that. Now, I want to also use the ROE in this example because we're going to have to compare these two companies. And the ROE, you will see that will play an important role in this comparison. So I'm just going to copy here the figure that we have for return on equity. In this case, it's negative. So that's 5.13%. Perfect. And now if we go to Netflix, I have it here. And so let's do the same. So total debt for Q2 2021, 15.63 for Netflix, 15.63 billion. The total equity or shareholders' equity is 13.86 billion. Perfect. And then debt to equity ratio will be 15.63 divided by 13.86. And here we see that we got 1.13, which is exactly what also Morningstar calculated here for Netflix. Perfect. And then return on equity for Netflix is 37.86%. Perfect. Okay, so we have everything we need. Let's highlight a few things here. So debt to equity, if we compare the two, we see that actually Netflix debt to equity is closer to 1 than Disney's. So we're gonna give Netflix the win here. And then we see that the return on equity for Disney is actually negative. So that's not a good sign. I'm gonna highlight that in yellow. And on the other hand, the return on equity for Netflix is actually 37.86%. That's pretty good. So I'm gonna highlight that in green. Now that we have the numbers, what can we conclude? Well, as you saw, both companies, Disney and Netflix, from a financial health perspective or debt to equity ratio perspective, they look in good shape. They are not highly leveraged, so that means that they are relatively low risk or safe investments. Now, Disney has a debt to equity ratio of 0.63 or 0.66, so it's below 1. That means that Disney could afford some more debt as long as it uses that debt to actually get more profitable. We see that the return on equity is actually negative. It's it's -5%. So that's not a very good sign. Now on the flip side, Netflix has a debt to equity ratio of 1.13, or actually, almost 1, which means that it is using debt to reasonably finance their growth. And also we can see that the return on equity for Netflix is actually very good. It's 30 plus percent, and that's a very good sign. All right, that's all I have for you guys. Thank you so much for joining me as usual. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate that. Stay tuned for more videos. I'll see you soon.